It's ironic how little most people know about sheep, given how deeply entrenched they are in human culture. They were domesticated over 10,000 years ago for use of their wool fleece, as well as for meat and milk. For thousands of years, they've been an important part of many different cultures and economies in Africa, Europe, and Asia. People wore clothes made out of wool, drank milk from the sheep, and ate its cheese and its meat. People wove tapestries for the walls, made carpets for the floors, and warm blankets for the winter, all out of sheep's wool. Sheep have even been referenced in religious texts and astrology. So if you're interested in finding out about where sheep come from, as well as some of their fascinating characteristics, then keep on watching to hear the story of sheep. Hi everybody, and welcome back to U University. I'm Dr. Kelly. Well, I've been on spring break this week, and I can't believe it's the end of the week already. The weather is finally warming up a little bit. A few days ago, I saw the first signs of spring when I noticed that we have some crocuses coming up, and they're just starting to push through the dirt. So maybe this cold, snowy winter that we've had is finally winding down. Since I'm on break, I took some time to do a little research into the history of sheep and read some surprising studies showing that sheep might not be as dumb as their reputation implies. So I'm going to share that information with you in this video. Let's start by going back in history to ancient times to find out, first of all, where sheep come from. Well, the short answer is that sheep are native to West Asia. As soon as people migrated to Asia from Africa about 60,000 years ago, they started hunting wild sheep with flint-tipped wooden spears and bows and arrows. But about 10,000 years ago, some people began to keep tame, domesticated sheep for themselves. Probably people began to herd sheep because there were a lot of people living in the area who were starting to settle down and farm, so wild sheep were getting harder to find. And it would be fairly easy to start herding sheep if you caught a few lambs in the wild and raised them to know you. Research at a prehistoric settlement in central Turkey shows that early farmers kept wild sheep penned up in the middle of their village. The international research team, led by Dr. Mary Steiner of the University of Arizona, looked at an archaeological layer carbon dated to about 10,400 years ago. The botanical remains from this level show intensive cultivation of cereals, lentils, and nuts, meaning that crop farming was already underway. The animal bones reflect the hunting of a wide variety of wild animals, including cattle, sheep, fish, turtles, and rabbits. The most abundant animal was sheep, which were clearly wild animals, as evidenced by their larger size and distribution of ages and sexes. Researchers know this because wild herds left alone by humans tend to include more older animals and equal numbers of males and females. However, beginning about 10,200 years ago, the proportions of wild animals in this layer began to change. The hunting of smaller animals decreased, while the percentage of sheep steadily increased. By about 9,500 years ago, sheep represented nearly 90% of all animals at the site. Moreover, the age and sex pattern of the bones indicate active management or herding of the sheep. There were a lot more male bones than female bones, indicating that about 60% of the males died at a young age. And this is a typical pattern that reflects farmers' desire to preserve females for breeding, so they would slaughter mostly the males for food. The research team also found ancient dung in large quantities between the closely packed houses of the settlement. And microscopic analysis of the dung confirmed that it came straight out of the animals rather than being mixed with other ingredients to make things like mortar or fuel for fires. And this means that the dung was the result of stabling the sheep rather than reuse by humans for other purposes. The researchers concluded that the sheep were kept penned in the village itself, even though the animals were still wild, as they had not undergone the reduction in size typical of domestic animals. They probably hadn't yet become the docile sheep we know today. Now, you might wonder, why would these early people need to pen up the sheep when they were already successful in hunting them? Well, the archaeologists believe that the fertile soil in this region tempted them to settle down and establish a permanent village and abandon their nomadic lifestyle. The downside of settlement would have been less time for roaming around and hunting for meat that they still needed in their diet. The best way to solve this problem would be to bring the sheep to the village rather than the villagers going out to find the sheep. This is probably how farmers began to domesticate animals by choosing less aggressive animals to keep around their village. So sheep were one of the earliest animals to be domesticated for agricultural purposes. A wild breed of sheep called the Mouflon is thought to be the primary ancestor of the modern domesticated sheep that we're familiar with today. They have a tolerance of extreme temperatures and are ideally suited for living in mountainous environments of Europe and Asia. Mouflons originated in Asia, but were introduced to Europe thousands of years ago. And today there are several subspecies of Mouflon that can be found in Europe and Asia. As you can see in this map, the European Mouflon are mostly in Corsica and Sardinia, and Asian Mouflon are in the Caucasus Mountains, Iraq, and Iran. They inhabit wooded areas on steep mountain slopes and mountain meadows. Mouflon are shy animals that are most active in the early morning and evening. They eat pretty much every type of vegetation: grass, flowers, buds, sprouts of bushes and trees, and even poisonous plants such as deadly nightshade. And their lifespan is about 10 to 12 years. Despite being the smallest wild sheep, Mouflons are sturdy animals with a thick neck and strong muscular legs. They only stand about 2 to 4 feet tall at the shoulders. The male has long spiral horns that can reach 25 inches in length. It takes up to 9 years for the horns to reach their maximum size. Females of some subspecies have little horns, but they're much smaller than the male's horns. They have a rough coat consisting of a woolly underfleece that is covered in winter by a coarse reddish-brown top coat with a dark area along the back. The males have a distinctive white patch in the winter. In the summer, this patch disappears. The female and young are gray or dark brown with no white patch. It's surprising to think that these early sheep did not have the fleecy wool we so readily associate with modern-day sheep breeds. It would take many millennia and careful breeding practices to produce these softer, woolly coats. Wild sheep generally have shorter, coarser fleece, and the wool colors are usually colored rather than white. These sheep would not have been shorn. Instead, the wool would have been harvested by plucking by hand. It was not until about 8,000 years ago that sheep were selectively bred to produce finer quality wool, and efforts to breed white-fleeced sheep began in Mesopotamia about 5,000 years ago. At this time, sheep farming spanned what is now Turkey into Europe as far north as modern-day Germany and south into northern Africa. The Phoenicians are credited with introducing sheep from Asia to North Africa, and these would form the foundation flocks for the later merino wool industry in Spain. Raising sheep for wool production was one of the earliest industries in the ancient world. The ancient Egyptians revered the male sheep, and the Greek economy was largely based on sheep providing meat, wool, and milk. Greek writings describe in detail selective breeding and wool processing. Roman writings also describe details of the sheep breeding process and wool fabric production. They also mention the existence of sheep farms with as many as 10,000 sheep. As this indicates, The ancient Romans kept sheep on a large scale, and it's likely that they helped sheep to spread throughout the continent of Europe and other territories of the Roman Empire. About 2,000 years ago, the Romans established the first wool mill in England, where wool production flourished so much that it would later dominate the industry during the Middle Ages. And by that time, sheep with characteristics similar to the modern breeds were becoming more widespread. In the Middle Ages, wool trading flourished in Europe, with cities in England, Spain, and Italy at the core. The most important raw wool producers were Spain and England, while the best processors were in Italy. England's kings would often sell English wool for years in advance when in need of funds. The Spanish jealously guarded their fine wool sheep, which later became known as the merino. These were introduced to Spain in the 12th century by a tribe of Arabic Moors from Africa known as the Ben Merinos, which is where merino sheep got their name. In the 15th century, Queen Isabella of Spain used the money earned from the wool industry to finance Christopher Columbus and the voyages of other explorers to the New World. In fact, Columbus himself was from a family of wool weavers. On his second trip, Columbus brought along sheep and left some of them in Cuba and Santo Domingo. In 1519, Cortez began exploring what are now Mexico and the western United States, and he brought sheep that are the ancestors of today's Navajo Churro breed. This is the oldest breed of sheep in the United States. Back in Spain, merino sheep became so prized that selling them outside the Spanish Empire was punishable by death. But as the Spanish Empire began to decline, the Spanish king himself gifted merino sheep to kings in France, Portugal, and the Netherlands. The Netherlands exported sheep to their colonies in South Africa, and from there, the sheep traveled with voyagers on their way to Australia. And that was the beginning of the merino sheep industry in Australia. Within 100 years, the wool industry had strong competitors across Europe, Russia, and the United States. Wool trade was so important for England that it imposed special taxes on wool exports, and fine English wool began to compete with silk on the international market. Although England had discouraged the wool industry in the American colonies because they didn't want the competition, settlers quickly smuggled sheep into the U.S. and developed their own wool industry. By 1664, there were tens of thousands of sheep in the colonies, and Massachusetts even passed a law requiring young people to learn to spin and weave. By 1698, America was exporting wool goods. England responded by outlawing wool trade, making it punishable by cutting off a person's right hand. Restrictions on sheep farming and wool manufacturing, along with many other complaints, eventually led to the American Revolutionary War. Today, there are over 10,000 distinct breeds of domesticated sheep. They are diverse in size and characteristics. Some have horns and some don't. Their wool varies in softness and other properties. Altogether, there are around 1.2 billion sheep on the planet, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Association. The world's largest producer of sheep is China, which is home to nearly 200 million of them. In comparison, Australia has around 70 million, and the UK has 33 million sheep. Okay, so that's a little bit of history about sheep. Now let's talk about some sheep facts and trivia. The largest breed of sheep is the Argali, which is found in Central Asia. They can weigh over 400 pounds. Contrast that to the bighorn sheep of the Rocky Mountains in North America, where the males weigh only up to 280 pounds. Sheep are social, but only usually with their own sex. Males have their own herds called bachelor herds, which contain up to 50 rams at one time. The females live in separate herds of up to 100 members, including adult females and their young. Sheep depend heavily on their vision. They have excellent peripheral vision. Their large rectangular pupils allow them to see almost 360 degrees, so they can see behind themselves without even turning their heads. However, they do have poor depth perception. Because of their wider field of vision, they can't see very well immediately in front of their noses. Sheep do perceive colors, although their color vision is not as well developed as it is in humans. In fact, sheep will often react with fear to new colors. Sheep have excellent hearing, and they can turn their ears in the direction of a sound. They are frightened by high-pitched sounds and loud noises, such as barking dogs and firecrackers. Their sense of smell is very good. They are sensitive to what different predators smell like. And their predators include coyotes, dogs, bears, big cats, foxes, and eagles. Sheep use their sense of smell to locate water and determine differences between different types of food. Smell helps rams locate ewes in heat, and it helps ewes locate their lambs. Sheep's milk is ideal for making cheese. Compared to cow's milk, it contains higher levels of calcium and vitamins A, B, and E. Sheep milk cheeses include feta, ricotta, roquefort, manchego, pecorino, and romano. The U.S. states with the highest numbers of sheep are Texas, Wyoming, and California. The term black sheep refers to a disreputable or disgraced member of a family. It's thought that this description comes from the notion that black fleeces could not be dyed and were therefore less valuable than white fleece. Okay, and what about the differences between sheep and goats? Well, sheep and goats may look similar, but they're completely different species. Sheep have 54 chromosomes and goats have 60 chromosomes. A big difference between sheep and goats is their foraging behavior and diet. Goats require a more nutritious diet and prefer to eat leaves, twigs, vines, and shrubs, and they especially like the tops of plants. They are very agile and like to stand on their hind legs to reach vegetation. Sheep, on the other hand, prefer to eat shorter, tender grasses, clover, and broadleaf weeds, and they like to graze close to the soil. In terms of behavior, goats are more curious and independent, while sheep have a stronger herding instinct and become distressed if separated from the rest of the flock. Physically, most goats have coats of hair that do not require shearing or combing. Most sheep grow woolly coats that need to be sheared at least once a year. Goats tend to have horns. Some sheep do have horns, but some do not. Goat horns are more narrow and upright and less curved than sheep horns. Sheep's horns tend to curl in loops on the sides of their heads. One of the easiest ways to tell the difference between a sheep and a goat is to look at their tails. A goat's tail naturally goes up, while sheep tails hang down or are often docked. Now, sheep have the reputation for being kind of dumb. They're perceived as a bunch of timid followers who are vulnerable to prey animals and they need to be protected. They've been observed going into a panic by the sound of rustling paper and have frozen to death in storms and drowned while crossing streams. Entire flocks have been burned to death in barns because they're too afraid to leave the burning building. But research is showing that sheep might not be as stupid as people think. Dr. Keith Kendrick and his research team from Cambridge University have published numerous studies investigating sheep's memory for faces. In one of their studies, they presented sheep with 25 pairs of sheep faces like this that differed by less than 5%. The animals were trained to associate each individual in the pictures with a food reward to enhance their learning to recognize individual faces. The scientists measured activity in regions of the sheep's brain associated with visual recognition. Sheep have groups of specialized neurons in the prefrontal cortex of the brain that are similar to those found in monkeys and humans, with a specific purpose of encoding faces as opposed to other objects. Results of the study showed that sheep could remember up to 50 sheep faces even when shown in profile. When the sheep were tested again 2 years later, they still recognized those same faces. In the next phase of the study, the researchers showed the sheep pictures of human faces and sheep faces of individuals in 3 categories: those they were very familiar with who were currently part of their social group, those whom they were familiar with but hadn't seen for at least 8 months, or individuals that they had never seen before. Their brain cells responded to the familiar faces, but not the unknown individuals. The sheep even vocalized responses to the face pictures of those who were currently in their social group and to those who used to be, but not the strangers. Another study from this same research team investigated whether sheep could discriminate between different species and individuals using facial recognition. The sheep were shown pictures of other sheep of the same or a different breed as they themselves were, as well as a goat, a dog, a human, and a feeding trough with food in it and one without food in it. The sheep participants approached the sheep pictures faster than the other pictures. In fact, they approached the sheep pictures 80 to 100% of the time, showing a preference for sheep faces over the faces of other animals, humans, and even food. They also preferred sheep from their own breed over other sheep breeds, even when they didn't personally know those sheep. In another part of the study, the researchers showed male and female sheep faces to ewes, female sheep, and their preferences differed depending on their reproductive fertility. During estrus, when they were at their maximum fertility, the female sheep preferred male sheep faces, and when they were not in estrus and not likely to get pregnant, they preferred the female sheep faces. So overall, these results suggest that sheep can use facial cues to discriminate between different species, sheep breeds, and male and female members of the same breed. In another fascinating study, exposure to face pictures of sheep of the same breed actually reduced stress caused by social isolation. In this study, the researchers showed sheep who had been separated from their flocks pictures of goats, triangles, or other sheep, and measured their heart rate as well as levels of cortisol and adrenaline, among other things. And these indicators of stress significantly declined when the lonely sheep looked at pictures of other sheep, but not the goats or the triangle symbol. Keith Kendrick's team at Cambridge also studied sheep preferences for facial emotional expressions. They wondered if sheep were able to recognize and use face emotion cues in their social interactions. To study this, they used pictures of the same individual sheep when it was calm and when it was distressed, after being isolated from its flock. The sheep participants were shown both pictures, and their heart rates significantly increased when viewing the stressed sheep picture. Next, the researchers used human face pictures with the same individual showing expressions of either happiness, where they were smiling, or anger. When sheep were given a choice of pictures, they showed more than 80% preference for the smiling human. They showed the same preference for the calm sheep when given the choice of the sheep pictures. Other studies that have examined emotional expression in sheep found that the key facial features for emotional displays in sheep are ear position and the appearance of the eyes. The most prominent change in the eyes in a stressed sheep is an increase in the amount of the white part of the eyes that is visible, as well as pupil dilation. Fear and anxiety would be indicated in a sheep whose eyes were open wider than usual with their pupils dilated. As far as emotion-related ear posture, what studies have found is that there appear to be 4 distinctive ear positions indicative of different emotional responses to the environment. The first is where the ears are horizontal to the sides of the head. This posture was found in neutral situations and most closely corresponds with happiness or being relaxed. The second position is where the ears are forward and raised, and this expression was elicited when they faced unfamiliar and unpleasant situations likely to cause anger. The third expression consisted of the ears going back, which happened in situations that were negative and uncontrollable, thus likely to elicit fear. Finally, the sheep showed an asymmetrical ear position where one ear went back and the other went forward, and this was seen in sudden, unexpected situations likely to produce surprise. Interestingly, several scientists have discussed the similarities in facial muscle networks in sheep and humans. In particular, the muscles that lower the eyebrows in humans are basically the same as the muscles responsible for raising the ears in animals. Since the eyebrows play a major role in expressing emotions in humans, it's probably not surprising that emotions in sheep are reflected in their ear posture. Researchers have even studied different facial features and their contributions to sheep's ability to recognize faces. For example, in one study, the sheep participants were exposed to a sheep face in a variety of ways while their brain activity was measured. In some of the pictures, the sheep was depicted normally, straight on. In others, different parts of the picture were missing, meaning that the feature was photoshopped out. And in some pictures, different parts of the face were blocked, meaning that a black rectangle was superimposed over a section of the image. So in one version, only the sheep's face was visible. In another, the sheep's face was missing. Other pictures showed the sheep in profile, upside down, with the eyes blocked or missing, with the mouth and nose blocked or missing, and the left and right sides blocked. The sheep's brains were most active when viewing the normal picture, indicating that they were paying attention to that face. The same was true for the picture where the eyes were missing and where only the nose was missing. Their brains were least active when the sheep picture was upside down, shown in profile, and when the face was missing altogether. A similar study from a different research team at Cambridge attempted to find out whether sheep could recognize human faces when presented in different perspectives. They first trained the sheep to recognize the faces of 4 human celebrities from photographs. Then they presented the celebrity face and an unfamiliar face on 2 screens in front of the sheep. Each screen had a button for the sheep to press with its head. And if the sheep selected the button with the face of the celebrity, they got a reward of food in the tray below. But they got nothing if they pressed the button under the unfamiliar face. Now the thing is that after the initial learning task, some of the pictures were presented with the faces front on, and some of them were presented with the images tilted. Amazingly, the sheep were still able to recognize the familiar celebrity faces even when presented at an angle. Their performance was only 15% less accurate than when the faces were presented front on. And that's pretty comparable to humans' performance in recognizing faces in profile and at different angles. So all of this research points to the fact that sheep have a visual perception system for faces that's very similar to that of humans, which enhances memory for individuals in their social group as well as emotional responses to those known individuals. Sheep are social creatures just like humans are, and it's fascinating to think how much we have in common with them. As the research shows, they display and recognize emotion by facial expression just like we do. They prefer smiles to frowns just like we do. And they have impressive facial recognition and memory skills just like we do. Throughout history, sheep and wool have been a part of human civilization ever since people changed from a nomadic way of life to settle down and begin farming. And all this time, sheep have performed their marvelous double duty of feeding and clothing humans. Despite their reputation as being dumb and mindlessly following the crowd, research reveals that sheep are far from the mindless creatures we often presume them to be. They share levels of intelligence previously only recorded in humans and non-human primates. So the next time you read something that portrays sheep as dumb and directionless and defenseless, remember that the truth is that sheep have the brain power to sometimes equal humans. And that brings us to the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed learning about the history of sheep and their intellectual abilities. Let me know down below what your thoughts are on this topic. Did you learn anything new? Were you surprised about anything I talked about today? What are your experiences with sheep? Have you ever personally seen evidence of sheep's surprising intelligence? Leave any of your comments or questions down below, or comment just to say hi. I love hearing from you and really enjoy hearing about your experiences with the topics I feature in my videos. I always read all of your comments, even though I'm very behind in responding at the moment. But thank you so much for watching and for supporting the U University channel here on YouTube. I'll see you next time, and until then, stay smart and have a sparkly week.